At 9:42 a.m., on July 14, 1944, First Lieutenant Ewald Swanson sat in the cockpit of a B-17G Flying Fortress nicknamed Mispa, watching black flak bursts bloom across the sky over Budapest. He was 24 years old, he'd already survived 17 combat missions, and today there was no such thing as a close call. Over Budapest, a close call was just a slower way to die. Mispa was one aircraft in a 60-bomber formation from the 483rd Bomb Group, flying out of Sterperone, Italy, under the 15th Air Force. The mission brief sounded clean and orderly. Hit the Shell oil refinery and the railway yards in German-controlled Budapest, disrupt supply lines feeding the Eastern Front, and then fly southwest and go home. But by mid-1944, every bomber crew understood the gap between the plan and reality. The Luftwaffe and German defenses had built a layered killing zone around the yards. Swanson's formation was flying into a storm made of steel, more than 288mm flak guns positioned around the target area, all firing upward into the bomber stream. Those shells didn't have to hit you dead center. They only had to burst close enough for jagged fragments to tear through aluminum the way shrapnel tears through paper. Swanson held Mispa steady in its slot because formation discipline was survival. If one bomber drifted, it could collide with another. If it fell behind, it became a lone target. And if it dropped out completely, it would be left in enemy airspace with nothing but its own guns and luck. Behind Swanson, the crew was spread through the aircraft exactly as they had practiced. Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt sat in the co-pilot seat. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley manned the bombardier station in the nose. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson navigated from the compartment beside him. And 8 more men filled the stations throughout the bomber, radio, gunnery positions, and the flight engineer keeping the aircraft alive. The flak began to find them. Mispa took hits in the tail section, then in the wings. Shrapnel punched holes through the fuselage, and the airplane stayed in formation anyway, because there was no safer choice. A damaged bomber still inside the group had at least a chance. A damaged bomber drifting away from the group was already halfway to a POW camp or a smoking crater. They were seconds from the target. Dudley released the bombs, 2 tons of high explosive dropping toward the railway yards below. The moment the load fell away, Mispa lurched upward. It's a small detail that crews felt in their bones. The aircraft suddenly lighter, climbing just a little, engines still straining, while the formation pressed onward. And then an 88mm shell hit the nose. There are hits that damage a bomber, and hits that erase part of it. This wasn't a crack in plexiglass or a ragged hole in the skin. The explosion was instantaneous, violent enough that the entire front section of Mispa simply ceased to exist. The nose compartment, the bombardier station, the navigator's position, the Norden bomb site, the plexiglass panels, everything forward of the cockpit, gone. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley died instantly. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson died instantly. 2 men erased in a heartbeat, and the aircraft around them suddenly transformed from a machine into a broken shape, still somehow moving through the air. The blast wave tore through what remained of the plane. Blood sprayed the flight deck. Cold air screamed into the open cavity at altitude. They were around 30,000 feet, where the temperature sat at roughly 40 degrees below zero. Cold that doesn't feel like weather, but like punishment. But the most immediate danger wasn't even the cold. It was physics. With no weight in the nose, the center of gravity shifted backward. Mispa pitched up into a near-vertical climb. A bomber that pitches up too far doesn't climb, it stalls. And a stalled heavy bomber at altitude, damaged over enemy territory, doesn't forgive. Swanson suddenly had no proper cockpit in front of him. He could see sky where instruments should have been. The instrument panel had been attached to the forward structure, now missing. No airspeed indicator, no altimeter, no artificial horizon, no familiar reference points at all, besides the horizon seen through the gaping hole. And then came the detail that makes this story almost impossible to believe. Swanson had no control column. The yoke had been mounted to the forward structure. The forward structure was gone. So the normal act of flying, hands on the yoke, feet on the rudder, eyes on the gauges, was no longer available. Mispa should have become unflyable right there. No cockpit instruments, no proper controls, a ruined aerodynamic shape, and still over a city protected by hundreds of heavy guns. Yet the aircraft did not fall out of the sky immediately. Something remained, something hidden in every aircraft's bones: the control cables. Inside a B-17, steel cables run from the cockpit back through the fuselage to the rudder, elevators, and ailerons. They're normally enclosed, routed through pulleys, hidden behind panels and structure, protected from wind, vibration, and accidental contact. But now those cables were exposed. They hung in the open air, rushing through what used to be the nose. And somehow, they were still intact. Swanson forced Mispa's nose down. He didn't know how, not in the normal sense, because there was nothing to push and nothing to pull the usual way. But the aircraft leveled, not smoothly, not confidently. It leveled the way a wounded animal staggers upright, by refusing to collapse. For a moment, Swanson could see the formation continuing ahead toward the rally point. Dark shapes against the summer sky. He could see where Mispa should have been, locked into its place, protected by the collective. But Mispa wasn't whole anymore. Mispa was a bomber with its face ripped off, still moving forward on borrowed seconds. If you want to understand what happened next, it helps to picture the interior of the aircraft in that moment. The open front cavity turned the bomber into a wind tunnel. Air hammered through the fuselage, tearing at loose fabric, rattling metal, and dragging anything light enough to move. The sound wasn't just loud, it was constant, violent, and exhausting. Behind Swanson, the surviving crew began moving forward. They could see the exposed cables running through the bomb bay area. They could see how the wind was yanking them. And they could see the simplest truth. Without someone physically controlling those cables, the aircraft wouldn't stay stable. Over the target, the flak was still active. They were still in enemy airspace. And in a damaged bomber, still can be a very short word. Then, at 9:44 a.m., a second 88mm shell struck. This one hit engine number 2. The right cyclone radial exploded in a spray of oil and metal fragments. Flames streamed back along the inboard nacelle on the left wing. The propeller windmilled for 3 seconds, then seized. Engine 2 was dead. Now Mispa had 3 engines instead of 4. And Swanson had no instruments to measure airspeed, no gauges to watch altitude loss, and no way to precisely track performance. He could only feel the aircraft sagging, slowly losing energy, while the rest of the formation continued at combat speed. Technical Sergeant Frank Gamenzi, the flight engineer, moved forward from the top turret position. He saw the cable bundles clearly: elevator, rudder, aileron. They were steel wire rope, about 3/8 of an inch thick. In normal flight, these cables are protected and guided. In Mispa, they were now being ripped and buffeted by the slipstream. Staff Sergeant George Simelli came up from the radio compartment. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell came forward from the waist gun position. No one needed to hold a meeting. No one needed a vote. They positioned themselves near the bomb bay where the main cable runs were visible. Swanson tried the rudder pedals. Nothing. The pedals still existed, but the cables were being buffeted too violently for normal actuation. Throttles still responded on engines 1, 3, and 4. That was something, But throttle power alone cannot replace control of the flight surfaces. If the aircraft pitched up again, it could stall. If it rolled into a spiral, it could tighten into a dive. Either way, the end would be fast. So the crew grabbed the cables. They wrapped sections around their hands for grip. The metal was brutally cold. It cut into their gloves. And when they pulled the rudder cable left, Mispa's nose moved left. When they pulled right, it moved right. The elevators responded the same way. Pull, and the nose rises. Release, and it drops. It worked. Barely. But worked isn't the same as safe. Every input had to be timed. Too much pressure and the aircraft would overreact. Too little and nothing would happen. And the cruel part, they were doing this without seeing what Swanson was seeing, without the usual communication, because the intercom system was damaged. Mispa began falling behind the formation. The other B-17s weren't being heartless. They couldn't wait. Every minute over Hungary meant fighters, flak, and death. Standard procedure was clear. If an aircraft couldn't maintain formation speed, it was left behind. By 9:46 a.m., Mispa was alone, a mile behind, then 2. Swanson could still see the formation in the distance, dark dots against bright sky. But the gap was growing, and Mispa was descending, not plunging yet. A steady loss, 30,000 down through 29,000, then 28,000. The men on the cables kept pulling, hands cramped. Blood flow was squeezed by steel biting into the palms. Swanson's situation was now defined by what he did not have. No airspeed indicator to tell him how close he was to a stall. No reliable altitude reference. No navigator. No fuel gauges. And in a bomber, not knowing your fuel is like not knowing whether your parachute exists. All Swanson knew was direction. Southwest. Get out of Hungary. Get over Yugoslavia. Reach the Adriatic. Reach Italy. Then, from the bomb bay, frantic waving toward the rear. Swanson couldn't turn around. Movement near that open nose was dangerous. If he unbuckled, the airflow could pull him forward and out of the aircraft. So he stayed locked in place, eyes on the horizon, trying to hold the wings level. But something was wrong in the tail. Tail Gunner Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker felt the structure flexing, metal moving in ways it should not move. That meant stress fractures or shrapnel-weakened supports. Something in the rear was beginning to fail. And if the tail came off, everyone aboard would die instantly. A B-17 without a tail would enter an unrecoverable spin, tumbling end over end until it broke apart or hit the ground. There would be no time to react, no time to bail out. Mispa continued southwest, still descending, still barely under control, held together by the last remaining structure and men doing the work of missing controls. How long the tail would hold was unknown. How long the fuel would last was unknown. How long 3 engines could keep them flying with the nose missing was unknown. But one thing was certain. Every minute over enemy territory increased the odds that Mispa would come apart with no warning. And Swanson knew he would soon have to make the decision no pilot wants to make, stay with the aircraft or order the men out, when he can barely communicate at all. If this story has you gripping your chair right now, do me a favor, hit that like button. It helps us keep rescuing stories like this from the archives. Subscribe if you haven't already, and let's go back to Mispa, because the worst part wasn't what they'd already lost. It was what they were about to choose. Part 2, 40-45 min total script. The flak stopped so suddenly it almost felt unreal. One moment, Mispa was flying through black bursts that could shred a bomber with a near miss. The next, there was only wind screaming through the open front of the aircraft like a giant mouth trying to swallow the cockpit whole. Swanson didn't know exactly where they were. He had no panel, no navigator, no clean map reading, Just the direction he'd burned into his mind, southwest. But he could tell something important by what he didn't hear anymore. No more flak bursts, no more detonations close enough to punch new holes. That meant they had likely crossed out of the heaviest defensive belt. It didn't mean they were safe. It meant they were alive long enough to face the next problem. Mispa was still dropping, slowly, steadily, almost calmly, like a wounded aircraft refusing to show panic. Swanson had no altimeter in front of him, but the descent was obvious from the horizon's behavior and the aircraft's feel. The three remaining engines were still running. Engine 1 on the far left wing, Engine 3 inboard on the right, Engine 4 on the far right, and their combined thrust was barely enough to keep the bomber moving forward at all. Without the nose, drag was enormous, and with engine number 2 dead, there was no spare power left to claw back altitude. Inside the fuselage, the men on the control cables had become the control system. Their hands were the missing yoke. Their timing was the missing instruments. Their muscles were the only thing keeping Mispa from rolling into a spiral or pitching up into another stall. And the cruelest part was how fragile that arrangement was. If one man let go for even a moment, because his grip slipped, because the cable cut too deep, because he had to move, control would degrade immediately, not in theory, in seconds. Swanson kept his feet on the rudder pedals, even though the pedals themselves couldn't do anything without the cables being held and pulled in the bomb bay. It was instinct, and it was also discipline. If he stopped acting like a pilot, the aircraft would stop behaving like an aircraft. He kept his hands on the throttles because the throttles were the one set of controls that still responded directly. Engines 1, 3, and 4 obeyed. That was the only clean connection he had left to the machine. But the fuel gauges were gone. That fact mattered more with each passing minute. A B-17 carried about 2,800 gallons spread across multiple tanks. Under normal cruise power, 4 engines burned roughly 200 gallons per hour. But Mispa wasn't at cruise. It was at maximum continuous power on 3 engines, dragging a destroyed aerodynamic profile through the air. Fuel burn would be higher. How much higher? Swanson couldn't know. And the worst kind of mechanical failure is the one that gives no warning. The engines wouldn't necessarily cough or sputter. Right cyclones could run smooth until they didn't run at all. When they quit, they quit. Swanson had another problem, one that wasn't mechanical but human. He had to decide what to do with the crew. If Mispa broke apart at altitude, no one would have time to escape. If the tail failed, as the men in the rear were already warning, it could happen instantly. A spin, a tumble, and then nothing. So the safest move for the men was to get out while the aircraft was still more or less stable. Captured was better than dead. A POW camp was better than being burned into wreckage. But evacuation required coordination. A B-17 bailout procedure assumed the aircraft was intact. It assumed the nose escape hatch existed. It assumed the intercom worked. It assumed the pilot could call out the order, sequence men through exit points, and still keep the aircraft steady. Swanson had none of that. The forward hatch was gone with the nose. The intercom was damaged, and Swanson could not leave his seat, because the moment he unbuckled, the aircraft would be uncontrolled. The men on the cables would have no reference for what input was needed. The bomber could pitch, roll, or dive within seconds. So the decision slid from pilot command into something else. It became a shared reality inside the fuselage. The men holding the cables could feel the tail flexing. They could see stress cracks spreading. They understood the math. The aircraft was dying, and the only question was whether it died with them inside it. By 9:52 a.m., Mispa was down around 24,000 feet, and they had been flying without a cockpit for roughly 10 minutes. 10 minutes that should not have been possible. 10 minutes that had already claimed 2 lives in the nose. And now the surviving crew members began doing the only rational thing left. One by one, they moved toward the waist gun windows, not in a neat line, not with calm instructions in their ears, but with the same grim precision you see in men who know there won't be a second attempt. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell went first. He clipped in, positioned himself at the opening, and jumped into the slipstream. The wind took him instantly. Then Staff Sergeant Charles Kelly. Then Staff Sergeant George Simelli. Then Technical Sergeant Frank Gamenzi. Each jump changed Mispa's behavior. The aircraft didn't notice a man leaving the way. It noticed a missing nose, but it noticed the loss of hands on the cables. With fewer people holding tension, the cables slackened more easily. The aircraft began to wallow. A subtle dip of the left wing, then a correction, then a dip the other way. The nose tried to creep upward again, always hunting for the stall that would finish them. Swanson adjusted throttles, because throttle was still the one lever he could pull without needing a cable crew to translate it. But throttle changes alone were a blunt tool. They could influence yaw and help stabilize, but they could not replace ailerons and elevators properly controlled. Back in the tail, Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker felt the structure flexing worse. He crawled forward, hands and knees, through the long fuselage, leaving the most isolated compartment in the bomber. When he reached the waist area, he saw empty positions where crewmen had been seconds before. He saw the exposed control cables now more slack, less controlled, less human. He understood instantly what the others already understood. The tail could fail at any moment. So Tucker clipped on his parachute and jumped. By 9:54 a.m., 5 men were descending under parachutes over Yugoslavia. They would be captured, but they would be alive. Alive mattered more than anything now. And the evacuation continued. Staff Sergeant Paul Hish, the waist gunner, went through the window opening and his parachute deployed cleanly. Then Staff Sergeant Robert Tucker, another waist gunner, followed seconds later. Each departure made the aircraft more unstable, because the aircraft wasn't being flown anymore. It was being held in the air, held together by the last functioning elements of stability and by people literally acting as the linkage between cockpit intention and control surfaces. At 9:56 a.m., the last remaining crewman reached the waist area, jumped, and vanished into the slipstream. Now only 2 men remained aboard, Swanson and Burnt. Mispa was still descending, down around 20,000 feet, and still barely controllable. 3 engines ran. The wings still generated lift. But with almost no one pulling cables, the bomber's ability to respond to anything sudden was nearly gone. Swanson turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Burnt's eyes. The wind noise would have drowned any words, but words weren't necessary. Burnt had no control column either, no instruments, no meaningful function left. If he stayed, he would die for nothing. So Burnt unbuckled. He stood carefully from the co-pilot seat. He moved aft through the crawlway behind the cockpit toward the waist gun exit, taking care not to be pulled forward by the airflow ripping through the open nose cavity. He looked back once, one final time at Swanson still locked in the pilot seat, hands on throttles, holding the dying aircraft as steady as humanly possible. And then Burnt jumped. Swanson was now alone. One man in what remained of a 65,000-pound bomber. No instrument panel, no yoke, no crew, just 3 engines, a shredded airframe, and the horizon through a missing nose. Mispa was descending at roughly 200 feet per minute, not a vertical dive yet, but an inevitable sink. The missing nose created enormous drag and destroyed the clean airflow the bomber was designed to ride. It really was a flying brick with wings, kept aloft only because the wings still produced lift and the engines still produced thrust. And still, Swanson stayed at the throttles, because now the decision wasn't about saving the aircraft, it was about buying time and distance for the men who had just jumped. German patrols would search for downed aircrew. If Mispa crashed immediately, the parachute landings would cluster near the crash site. If Swanson kept the bomber flying longer, the men below would drift farther away, spreading out across miles instead of landing right beside the wreck. That separation could mean the difference between being scooped up within minutes, or lasting long enough to find cover, or at least not being captured as a group. But staying aboard had a price. The tail was still flexing. The aircraft could break apart without warning. And when Swanson finally decided to bail out, he would have to do it without assistance, while the aircraft was no longer truly under control. He tried to estimate where he was. They had been flying southwest for about 14 minutes since leaving Budapest. Airspeed was likely around 180 mph, maybe less. That suggested about 40–45 miles, but it was guesswork without instruments and without a navigator. Still, he believed they were over Yugoslavia now, possibly approaching mountains, possibly edging toward the Adriatic region. Belief built from direction and elapsed time, not certainty. And then Swanson made his final, cold decision. He would stay with Mispa for 2 more minutes. 2 minutes more distance for the crew, 2 minutes more separation from the crash site. Then he would go. He kept his hands on the throttles. The engines continued their steady roar, smooth, deceiving, giving no clue about fuel state. The bomber descended through 18,000 feet. Each second made the bailout riskier, but each second also gave the men below a better chance. And at 10 a.m. Exactly. Swanson released the throttles. He unbuckled his harness. The instant the straps loosened, he felt the airflow try to drag him toward the open cavity where the nose used to be. He braced against the seat and stood anyway. Immediately, Mispa began to change attitude. Without a pilot steadying the throttles and making constant micro-corrections, the bomber started a gentle left roll. Swanson moved quickly toward the rear of the flight deck and squeezed into the narrow crawlway leading back toward the bomb bay. Behind him, the bomber's nose began to drop. The control cables were slack now, no hands, no tension, no control. He had maybe 30 seconds before the dive steepened enough to make movement impossible. He reached the waist gun area, grabbed his parachute pack, clipped it to his harness, and stepped to the window opening. The aircraft was diving now, steeply enough that he had to brace himself against the fuselage to stay upright. He looked down at the Yugoslav countryside far below and jumped. The slipstream hit him like a physical wall. The bomber flashed past, engines still roaring, already accelerating downward. Swanson pulled the ripcord and the parachute deployed with a violent jerk that knocked the wind from him. And suddenly, after all that noise, there was a kind of silence, just wind and distance. Swanson watched Mispa fall. The tail section was still attached, but only barely. At about 15,000 feet, the tail separated. The forward section pitched down almost vertically and disappeared into a line of trees about 2 miles away. A column of black smoke rose moments later as the fuel ignited on impact. Nothing survived that crash. No one could have survived it. If Swanson had stayed aboard even 30 seconds longer, he would have died. But Swanson was alive, floating under canopy, drifting southwest with the wind. Below him, farms, forests, villages, and somewhere down there, German occupation forces. Then the ground rose faster than he expected. He tried to steer toward an open field, but the canopy wasn't designed for precise maneuvering. Trees were directly below. He hit the upper branches at roughly 15 knee map. Branches snapped. The parachute canopy snagged. Swanson slammed into a thick limb on his left side and felt the bone break, cleanly, somewhere between knee and ankle. Pain exploded through his leg as he came to a stop, tangled in lines and broken branches about 15 feet above the ground, bleeding and unable to climb down. And then he heard voices below, German voices. Swanson hung motionless in the parachute harness, tangled in lines and broken branches about 15 feet above the ground. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle. Blood ran down the fabric of his flight suit from deep cuts along his left thigh, where branches had torn through cloth and skin. The pain was sharp enough to make the world narrow into a single thought. Don't black out. Below him, German soldiers gathered at the base of the tree within minutes. They were Wehrmacht infantry, occupation troops stationed in the area, moving fast because they'd seen parachutes descending and heard the bomber crash. Swanson couldn't run. He couldn't climb down. He couldn't even shift his weight without the broken bone grinding inside the boot. One of the soldiers called up to him. Swanson didn't answer. The soldiers began talking among themselves about how to get him down. They went to a nearby farm and returned with a ladder. 2 men climbed up, cut the parachute lines, and lowered Swanson carefully. When he touched the ground, they laid him on his back in the dirt. A German medic arrived and immediately focused on the injuries that would kill him fastest: blood loss and shock. He examined the broken leg, then applied a temporary splint using wooden boards and strips of cloth. Then he injected morphine from his kit. Within minutes, the edge of the pain dulled into a distant, heavy throb. The medic wrapped Swanson's cuts with bandages and checked for additional injuries: ribs, head trauma, signs of internal bleeding. The leg remained the main problem. Without proper treatment, infection would come quickly. The Germans transported Swanson to a local command post. From there, he was moved to a Wehrmacht medical facility. A German doctor confirmed the fracture and set the bone properly. Even with morphine, it was agonizing, and Swanson passed out twice during the procedure. When he regained consciousness, his leg was sealed in a plaster cast from ankle to hip. Through an interpreter, the doctor explained that the break was clean and would heal, but Swanson would not walk normally for months. It was a clinical statement, not a comfort. But it meant one thing that mattered: he would live long enough to become a prisoner. Over the next 3 days, the rest of Mispa's surviving crew was captured. All 8 men who bailed out were found within about a 20-mile radius of the crash site. None of them managed to evade. The Yugoslav countryside in that area was heavily patrolled, and while partisan resistance existed in the mountains, the crew had landed in farmland controlled by German forces. One by one, Swanson saw them arrive: Burnt, Gamenzi, Semelli, Bell, Kelly, Tucker, Hish, alive. Mostly uninjured: cuts, bruises, the kind of damage men carry when they've been thrown out of a plane by the sky itself. They were processed and then transported to a prisoner of war camp in Austria, Stalag Luft 4, specifically designated for captured Allied aircrew. The camp held roughly 10,000 American and British prisoners: pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and flight engineers. The conditions were harsh, but not designed for spectacle. Food was limited. Red Cross parcels arrived irregularly. Barracks were cold in winter. Medical care was minimal. But for officer prisoners, the Germans generally followed Geneva Convention protocols. No mass executions, no systematic torture, just confinement, hunger, boredom, and time that moved like a slow punishment. Swanson's leg healed slowly. For the first 2 months, he moved on crutches. The cast came off in September 1944. There was no modern rehab program waiting for him, just basic movement and stubborn repetition. Every day he walked the camp perimeter, forcing strength back into a damaged limb. By October, he could walk without assistance. By November, the limp was barely noticeable. By December, he was physically recovered, but still behind wire, still counting days, with the same dull disbelief as the other men. And in that wire-boxed routine, the crew of Mispa did what almost every surviving crew does. They replayed the moment that separated life from death. They talked about the mission. They talked about the first flak hits. They talked about the bomb release, 2 tons of high explosive leaving the aircraft, and the sudden upward lurch. They talked about the 88mm shell that hit the nose and erased the front section of the plane. And they talked about the 10 minutes. 10 minutes that didn't belong in any flight manual. 10 minutes flying without instruments, without a cockpit, with bare control cables exposed to the slipstream. 10 minutes where the aircraft stayed airborne because men wrapped steel cables around their hands and turned themselves into the missing controls. They also talked about the 2 men who didn't make it past the first second. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley, killed instantly when the 88mm shell hit. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson, killed beside him. They were 23 and 24 years old. They never made it to the bailout decision. They never reached the waist gun windows. They simply vanished with the nose of the aircraft. Time in a POW camp changes the texture of memory. At first, men repeat the story like a wound they can't stop touching. Later, it becomes a ritual, something you say because if you stop saying it, you feel like you're letting the dead disappear. The crew of Mispa settled into captivity with that story as the axis everything rotated around. Winter turned to spring. As Soviet forces advanced from the east, the Germans began evacuating camps. Prisoners were marched westward in long columns. Conditions deteriorated quickly. Food became scarce. Some men died during the forced marches. Others escaped in the confusion as the Third Reich began collapsing under the pressure of 2 fronts. Swanson and his crew stayed together. They marched through Germany as the world around them broke apart. Towns in ruins, roads clogged, guards less confident, the shape of authority cracking in real time. For months, they had been prisoners in a system that felt permanent. Now the system looked tired, hungry, and afraid. Then, on April 30th, 1945, American forces reached their column. Liberation didn't arrive with speeches. It arrived with vehicles, uniforms, food, water, cigarettes, and the sudden, unbelievable realization that the waiting was over. American soldiers distributed supplies. Medical personnel checked for injuries and disease. The former prisoners were transported to collection points, then to airfields, then back to Italy, and eventually back to the United States. The crew of Mispa went home, all 8 survivors. Swanson returned to civilian life in Michigan. He married, raised a family, and worked quietly for decades. When people asked about the war, he rarely said much. When pressed, he would say only that he'd been lucky, that the crew had been lucky, and that Dudley and Henderson had not. Swanson never described himself as a hero. He described himself as a pilot who did his job under circumstances that shouldn't have allowed anyone to do anything. The Army Air Forces disagreed in its own way. Swanson was promoted over the years and eventually retired as a lieutenant colonel. The recognition wasn't pinned to one dramatic moment, but that one moment remained the defining story. The men stayed in contact. They attended 483rd Bomb Group reunions. Every few years they gathered to remember the missions, the fear, the strange camaraderie, and the men who never returned. What held them together wasn't only friendship, it was the fact that they'd shared something that should have ended them. George Simelli kept photographs from the mission and later showed them to his grandchildren, explaining what it meant to pull steel cables while a bomber came apart around you. Frank Gamenzi returned to his family and rarely spoke about the war. Paul Berndt remained near Swanson in Michigan. They stayed friends for life. Others scattered across the country, but they all remembered. Ewald Swanson died in 2009 at the age of 89. He lived long enough to watch aircraft evolve from propeller-driven bombers to jets, and from jets to spacecraft. But the aircraft he remembered most clearly was Mispa, the B-17G that lost its entire nose over Budapest and stayed in the sky on nothing but determination and bare hands. And if this story hit you the way it hits every crewman who hears it, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about men who refused to quit when physics said they should. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia. Our community is everywhere. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley died instantly when that 88mm shell hit. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson died beside him. They were 23 and 24 years old. They never came home. But the 8 men who survived carried their memory forward through 9 months of captivity and through decades afterward. And now, through this story, their names live on.